Let's go back to 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is assassinated in Sarajevo. Within weeks, Europe's great powers are mobilizing for war, and by the end of the summer, a regional crisis has become a global catastrophe. World War I, which ultimately involved more than 30 countries and cost an estimated 20 million lives, and fundamentally reshaped global politics, has begun. So here's the question. Why did it happen? Why did World War I actually break out? A realist might say it was all but inevitable. The European balance of power had grown unstable. Great powers were arming rapidly, locked in a classic security dilemma. Once Austria moved on Serbia, alliances dragged everyone else in. A liberal might counter that it was a failure of diplomacy. Weak international institutions, secret treaties, and a lack of transparency provided the fuel for the conflict. And if democratic peace theory holds, maybe war erupted, at least in part, because European monarchies of the day weren't constrained by public accountability. A constructivist might say that it was about identity and perception. Nationalism was surging, rivalries were stoked by narratives of honor, militarism, and civilizational destiny. States didn't fear each other's power, they feared who they believed others were. A Marxist might see imperial competition beneath it all, rival capitalist empires jockeying for colonies, trade routes, and global dominance, with war serving the interests of the economic elites. A feminist perspective might ask, why were military decisions made almost entirely by men? What role did masculinized values like strength, sacrifice, conquest, and so on play in escalating the conflict? And a postcolonial theorist would remind us that this war was never just a European war. Rather, it was global from the beginning, drawing soldiers and resources from across the colonies in order to feed the war machine. And that the peace that followed, the Treaty of Versailles, redo the global map with little regard for the people who were living there, reinforcing this global system of imperialism. It's the same war, but with fundamentally different explanations. So, which theory is right? Or are they all just highlighting different pieces of a much bigger puzzle? In our last video, we looked at how the different theories help us define and understand war. In this video, we'll focus on what those same theories and a few other perspectives tell us about why war happens, using World War I as our case study. So, if our previous video asked, what is war and how has it changed? This video asks a more specific question. Why does war happen in the first place, and what can theory teach us about how to prevent it? From a realist perspective, war is not an aberration from the normal state of peace. It's a predictable feature of an anarchic system. In 1914, Europe was a continent of great powers locked in an arms race, each uncertain of the other's intentions and none willing to back down. The balance of power was shifting. Germany was rising, Britain and France were trying to maintain their dominance, and Russia was expanding its influence in the Balkans. No central authority existed to mediate disputes or to prevent escalation. In realist terms, anarchy reigned. Realists would argue that war broke out not because leaders were irrational or because institutions failed, but because the international system left states with no safe alternatives. In such a system, even defensive moves can look threatening. When Austria-Hungary moved to punish Serbia after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, Russia mobilized to defend its Slavic ally. Germany in turn mobilized to back Austria, France followed, and Britain entered when Belgium was invaded. Each step may have seemed cautious or rational from the inside, but from the outside, it looked like aggression. This is the heart of the security dilemma. Actions taken by one state to improve its own security, like mobilizing troops or forming alliances, are interpreted as threats by others, triggering a spiral of response and escalation. Realists also point to the rigid alliance system as a key structural cause. Germany's backing of Austria-Hungary, often referred to as the blank check, made escalation more likely. Once alliances were triggered, war became the least bad option for many states, even for those who had hoped to avoid it. Thus, in this view, World War I wasn't caused by diplomacy gone wrong or clashing ideologies. It was the logical result of power politics in a multipolar system that many realists considered especially unstable, with shifting alliances, uncertainty, and less clear deterrent structures than in a bipolar world. While realists saw the war as a product of power politics and anarchy, liberals see war, especially World War I, as a failure of institutions, transparency, and trust. From a liberal perspective, the tragedy of 1914 wasn't inevitable. It was the result of bad diplomacy, secret treaties, and the absence of robust international organizations that could have diffused the crisis before it spiraled out of control. In the years leading up to the war, Europe lacked effective mechanisms for collective security or dispute resolution. There was no League of Nations, no United Nations, no international forum to arbitrate grievances between Austria and Serbia, or to pressure Germany and Russia to de-escalate. Once mobilization began, the lack of institutional communication channels meant that states stumbled towards war with limited coordination or clarity. Liberal theorists also point to the fact that most of the major powers in 1914 were not democracies in the modern sense. The Kaiser in Germany, the Tsar in Russia, even the British monarchy still held enormous executive power. According to democratic peace theory, democratic states rarely go to war with one another. Had Europe been more democratic, liberal theorists contend, public opposition to war and institutional checks on executive authority might have prevented escalation. Liberal theorists also point to the failure of economic interdependence. While Europe was interconnected through trade and finance, so much so that many believed a major war was impossible because it would be ruinously expensive for all sides, these economic ties were ultimately not strong enough to overcome the pressures of nationalism and strategic insecurity. As a result, liberals often point to this as a cautionary tale, demonstrating that economic ties alone aren't enough and must be reinforced by shared institutions, norms, and democratic accountability. In this view, World War I wasn't a systematic inevitability, it was a preventable breakdown, a failure of diplomacy, a deficit of democracy, a warning about what happens when international institutions are too weak to matter and when states operate in isolation rather than in cooperation. Realists focus on power and structure, liberals focus on institutions and regimes, but constructivists focus on meaning. In their view, war wasn't just a reaction to threats, it's shaped by the ideas, identities, and narratives that actors carry with them. When constructivists look at the outbreak of World War I, they don't just ask who had the biggest army or which alliances were in place. They ask, how did European states see themselves and each other in 1914? What ideas about nationalism, honor, and civilization were shaping their choices? In the early 20th century, Europe was saturated with militaristic norms and nationalist identities. War wasn't just considered acceptable. In many places, it was seen as noble, even rejuvenating. Schoolbooks taught children to prepare for glory. Newspapers framed diplomacy as weakness. The idea of the honorable war was deeply embedded in political culture. At the same time, rival states were constructed as existential threats. Germany saw itself as encircled by enemies. France still seethed over its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. Russia cast itself as the protector of Slavic identity. Serbia embraced a nationalist project of pan-Slavism. These weren't just geopolitical calculations, they were deeply held beliefs shaped by history, culture, and myth. And because identities were so polarized, diplomacy was often interpreted through a lens of fear and mistrust. The same actions, like mobilizing troops or issuing ultimatums, could be framed either as defensive or aggressive, depending upon who was doing the interpreting. Constructivists also emphasize the social nature of alliances. Austria, Hungary, and Germany didn't just have a treaty, they shared an identity as empires facing internal nationalist threats. Likewise, Britain's alliance with France and Russia was underpinned by a growing sense of civilizational identity against perceived German aggression. In this view, World War I wasn't just a failure of balance or diplomacy. It was the culmination of a system of meanings about what it meant to be a great power, what it meant to be honorable, and who could be trusted. The war happened in part because European leaders believed in war as a legitimate, even a necessary expression of their place in the world. From a Marxist perspective, World War I wasn't about balance of power or diplomatic failure, it was about imperialism, capitalism, and the pursuit of profit. In this view, the global system in 1914 was already defined by deep economic inequality between the industrial capitalist powers of Europe and their colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. In some ways, the possession of colonies was the marker of prestige, defining what it meant to be a great power in Europe. But equally importantly, they fueled the industrial development and the empowerment of European colonizers through the extraction of raw materials, labor, and markets from the colonies. Marxist and neo-Marxist theorists argue that the roots of the war lay in the economic competition between rival capitalist states, each seeking to expand their own global influence. Germany, the new industrial powerhouse, was challenging Britain's naval dominance and colonial reach. France, still bitter over its defeat and relative decline, wanted to reassert itself. The Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires were in economic and political decline, but still clinging to influence. These powers clashed not only in Europe, but across the global periphery, especially across Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East. Drawing on the work of Vladimir Lenin, Marxists argue that this wasn't an accident. Rather, it was the logical consequence of capitalism's internal contradictions. When domestic markets became saturated and profits began to fall, capitalists looked abroad for cheap labor, new consumers, and access to resources. War among the capitalist powers was, in Lenin's words, the highest stage of capitalism. Marxists also highlight how the war served the interests of the ruling class in each country. While working-class people were conscripted, killed, and displaced, bankers, arms manufacturers, and industrialists often profited from the war effort, supplying weapons, financing armies, and expanding control over colonial empires. From this view, then, World War I was not a tragic misunderstanding or the inevitable result of anarchy. It was a structural conflict driven by the economic logic of an exploitative global system, one that made war not only possible, but profitable. Feminist approaches to international relations ask a different set of questions. They don't focus on states, weapons, or treaties. Instead, they ask, how is war gendered? Who makes the decisions? Who bears the costs? And what values are we privileging when we talk about security? When feminists look at World War I, they see a war shaped by patriarchal institutions, masculine ideas of honor and power, and the systemic exclusion of women from diplomacy, leadership, and foreign policy. Every decision leading up to the war, from ultimatums to mobilization, was made by elite men operating in overwhelmingly male institutions like royal courts, general staffs, or foreign ministries. Feminist theorists point to how militarism and masculinity were tightly intertwined in the early 20th century. War was framed not just as a necessity, but as a test of national manhood. Propaganda glorified courage, sacrifice, and aggression, while associating peace with weakness or even femininity. In this sense, the war was as much about proving identity as it was pursuing national interests. At the same time, feminist scholars highlight the unequal impacts of war. While men were conscripted and sent to the trenches, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, often in dangerous and exploitative conditions in factories and hospitals. In the colonial context, women faced forced labor, sexual violence, and the upheaval of local economies that supported their communities. And yet, despite their contributions, women were largely excluded from post-war negotiations. And this exclusion wasn't for lack of trying. Despite the creation of a Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in 1915 and impassioned calls for inclusion, women were formally excluded from negotiations at Versailles. In this view, World War I was not just a failure of diplomacy or power politics, it was equally a product of a deeply gendered international system. Postcolonial approaches to international relations ask us to look beyond Europe and to examine the global order and how war is shaped by the enduring legacies of empire, race, and colonial violence. From this perspective, World War I was not simply a European tragedy, it was a global imperial conflict rooted in competition among colonial powers for the control of people, resources, and territory. The war was fought not just in Europe, but across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Millions of colonial subjects from India, Senegal, Algeria, and beyond were conscripted and coerced into fighting and dying for European empires in a war they didn't start. Postcolonial scholars argue that to understand the war's causes, we need to look to the system that produced it, a system of racialized global hierarchy. European powers justified their expansion through ideologies of civilizational superiority, and they extended that logic to one another. The war, in this view, was not just about balance of power, it was equally about imperial competition and the clash of empires struggling to preserve dominance and extract wealth from the periphery. These scholars also highlight how the colonial origins of conflict boundaries contributed to the violence both during and after the war. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, for example, divided the Ottoman Empire's Arab provinces between Britain and France with no consultation with the people who lived there. The redrawing of borders in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia similarly imposed artificial boundaries that would later become flashpoints for ethnic conflict and rebellion. In this view, the First World War was not just the result of European miscalculation, it was the logical outcome of a global system built on domination, exploitation, and the erasure of indigenous and local sovereignty and non-Western ways of understanding politics and peace. A system in which the voices of the colonized were absent, both in the causes of war and in the peace that followed. Postcolonial theorists thus challenge us to rethink what it means to call World War I a world war, and to ask whose histories and whose experiences are missing when we tell the story. Theories like realism, liberalism, or feminism help us understand the big structure and the ideas behind the conflict, but they don't necessarily capture everything. Sometimes wars happen not because of systemic forces, but because of human psychology, local grievances, or even environmental breakdown. As we considered in the previous video, international relations often assumes states and their leaders are rational actors. But what if they're not? Research in political psychology has shown that misperceptions, cognitive biases, and flawed decision-making can all lead to war, even when no side wants it. Leaders may fall into mirror imaging, seeing the other side as inherently hostile and interpreting defensive actions as aggression. In a similar way, think of the hawk bias in global politics, which often encourages more aggressive reactions in response to interpretations that frame opponents' actions as inherently aggressive. Decision-makers may also suffer from groupthink, surrounding themselves with advisors who reinforce their assumptions. Or they may escalate conflicts out of a desire to save face, avoid appearing weak, or maintain domestic legitimacy, a phenomenon sometimes described as diversionary war theory. According to diversionary war theory, leaders facing domestic unrest may provoke external conflict to rally nationalist sentiment or distract from internal crises. Path dependency may also play a role. Think of World War I. Some historians argue that European leaders didn't expect a full-scale war. They thought their shows of strength would be enough to deter the other side. But once mobilizations started, they became locked in a path they couldn't easily reverse. And more recently, U.S. intelligence failures from Vietnam to Iraq have been linked to confirmation bias, this tendency to interpret new information as confirming existing beliefs. These psychological explanations remind us that war is often the result of a cascade of misread intentions, flawed assumptions, and high-stake miscalculations. When it comes to civil war, scholars have long debated whether people fight primarily because they're angry and oppressed or because there's money to be made. This is often framed as the greed versus grievance debate. Grievance-based explanations maintain that civil wars arise primarily from ethnic, religious, or political exclusion, fueled by groups that feel marginalized, discriminated against, or repressed by the state. An example of this might be South Sudan, where decades of ethnic and political repression led to recurring civil conflict. By contrast, greed-based explanations assert that conflict becomes appealing when there are opportunities to profit. For example, through looting, extortion, or control of natural resources like diamonds, oil, or drugs. While rebel groups may use the language of grievance, their real motivation may be resource extraction. An example of this might be Sierra Leone's civil war, where access to conflict diamonds clearly fueled the violence. Most scholars today, though, agree that greed and grievance overlap. Grievances may motivate the start of a rebellion, but greed can sustain it. In other words, civil wars are not just about ideology or identity, they're also about economics and how local conditions can make violence a viable option for elites, warlords, or opportunistic actors. Finally, a growing body of research links conflict to environmental degradation, resource scarcity, and climate stress. When water is scarce, farmland dries up, or food prices spike, tensions can rise, especially in fragile or unequal societies. For this reason, the U.S. military has described climate change as a threat multiplier, essentially arguing that it may not cause war directly, but it nevertheless amplifies existing vulnerabilities. One widely discussed example is Syria. Years of drought between 2006 and 2010 displaced hundreds of thousands of rural farmers. Combined with a poor government response and political repression, this intensified social grievances, which helped set the stage for civil unrest and ultimately the civil war. And in places like Darfur, South Sudan, and Yemen, conflicts are deeply intertwined with disputes over land, water, and survival. As climate change accelerates, these pressures are expected to grow and may drive more conflict in the decades ahead. These causes, psychological, economic, environmental, don't fit neatly into any one theory, but they remind us that war isn't just about high politics and power. It's about equality and perceptions, inequality, and the planet we live on. And as a result, understanding the causes of conflict means looking into many directions at once and paying attention to how those different factors often interact. So when we ask, why do wars happen? Theory doesn't give us a single answer. It gives us a map of where to look and why it matters.